to the chaos God. Praise to the chaos God. Praise to the chaos God. Praise the chaos God.
Ever since I started watching the alternative media around 15 years ago, ever since I started learning about the globalists and their plans to implement an authoritarian, communist world government, I have seen the world follow this path without deviation. And we are now at the stage where the communist infiltration is so advanced and confident that it is only being denied by the terminally stupid or those who secretly wish it to happen. In this video, I am going to show you a shortened version of a lecture given in 1969 by G. Edward Griffin of the John Birch Society. In it you will see documentation of the communist plan to take over the US. You will see that the current turmoil was planned a long time ago, and it will give you a much more solid political and historical understanding of where we have come from and how that relates to where we are now. It will help you to see that the more things appear to change, the more they stay the same. I've edited the lecture from around an hour and a quarter down to under 30 minutes, but stick with it because it's well worth your time, and I'll speak to you again afterwards. Enjoy.
Now, in 1960, the representatives from communist parties all over the world gathered in Moscow and issued a joint declaration which included this statement: "Our time, whose main content is the transition of capitalism to socialism, is a time of socialist revolutions and national liberation revolutions." In other words, simply stated, we're living in an era of two kinds of revolution, one violent and the other nonviolent. In order to relate this general concept of two kinds of revolution to the specific application here in the United States, it'll be necessary for us to examine rather closely the communist position on what they describe as the Negro question. As early as 1928, the communists declared that the racial differences among our people constituted the weakest and most vulnerable point in our social fabric. The communists proclaimed that the American Negro constituted a separate nation within a nation, a colony within the continental borders of the United States. The people of this nation were said to be oppressed and exploited by colonialist, imperialist, racist America. Consequently, the Communist Party called for their liberation, their right to self-determination, to break away from the United States and to set up their own nation within our borders. But they aren't going to settle for just part of the United States. They want all of it. And so they made it clear long ago that their violent war of national liberation must be secondary to the nonviolent proletarian revolution. To take the United States, all of the United States, it'll be necessary, they say, to involve white people as well as black, to create a broad coalition, a revolutionary link between the civil rights movement, organized labor, peace groups, student dissidents, and in general, to escalate the revolution in America from race war to class war. Now, this communist booklet, entitled American Negro Problems, was published in 1928. It was written by John Pepper, alias Joseph Pogany. Now, Pogany was sent to this country as the personal envoy of Joseph Stalin, and his specific mission was to bring the American Communist Party into line with the policies and directives from Moscow, particularly with regard to the Negro question. And here is what Pogany said: "The Communist Party of America, in its fight against imperialism, must recognize clearly the tremendous revolutionary possibilities of the liberation movement of the Negro people." Now, Political Affairs is the official monthly magazine of the Communist Party in this country. The date on this particular issue is November 1968. The feature article for that month was "The Right of Black America to Create a Nation," written by communist theoretician Claude Lightfoot. Now, Lightfoot points out that many years of migration of Negroes into the North and of Caucasians into the South have altered the population statistics to the point where the black belt is considerably smaller today than it was when the communist position on the Negro question was first drafted. Therefore, he says, the concept of a Negro nation must not necessarily be restricted to just one large territory in the South, but must be expanded now to include the so-called ghetto areas in the North. Now, in passing, ladies and gentlemen, you may have wondered why the Communist Party has been a staunch supporter of the drive to place a black studies curriculum into our high schools and colleges. Well, the reason becomes obvious the minute you take a look at the textbooks and the study guides. The net effect of these courses on the students who enroll is to create a consciousness of nation. Now, here is a piece of vicious communist propaganda that perhaps some of you have seen. It's called The Crusader. It's published periodically in Red China and is widely circulated through the Negro communities here in America. It's written by Robert F. Williams, one of the organizers of the Revolutionary Action Movement. Williams also was the president of the local chapter of the NAACP in Monroe, North Carolina. At that time, needless to say, he wasn't telling very many people that he was also a member of the Communist Party. Robert Williams proceeds to explain in minute detail exactly how to manufacture the devices that can be used by a mere handful of people to ensure that highly automated America will lose its electrical power, its modern transportation, and its industrial capacity. Compound that with no food, no electricity, no way to dispose of sewage, no police protection, no water pressure to fight fires, no radio or TV, no telephone, no buses, no gasoline for your car, no way to escape, no place to go if you could. Part of the plan calls for commando squads of black revolutionaries to drive into the white residential areas and shoot little children playing on the sidewalks for the sole purpose of drawing out of the white communities violent retaliation into the black communities. Now, this is extremely important to the communists. They must have it, for in this way they plan to unite the entire Negro population for protection behind the militant minority. The violent revolution becomes of primary value to the communists to the extent to which it can be used to condition the masses psychologically to accept the nonviolent revolution. The public is to be pressured into accepting measures that will move the country gradually and legally toward communism, but without calling it that. The strategy of the proletarian revolution calls for the quiet conversion of our government into a communist regime, but under the banner of socialism. The new program of the Communist Party on this subject has this to say. The term socialism describes but the first stage of a new society that in its full development is called communism. Socialism is a transitional stage, but they promote socialism just the same because they know that socialism by definition means control over people. If we're dependent upon the government for our food, our clothing, our shelter, our jobs, our medical care, then we're far more effectively controlled by those who hold political power than if they stood over us with soldiers and weapons. Some years ago, I happened to attend a meeting where several anti-communist refugees from behind the Iron Curtain were called upon to relate their personal experiences. One of the refugees spoke up and he said, "You know, I came to America expecting to find a nation of free men. But instead, I find exactly the same thing. Everywhere I look, I see men and women who know that communists are making headway in this country. They know that something must be done and that someone must stand up to them. But they themselves do nothing. They remain silent because they're afraid that if they speak out or take a stand publicly, it'll be bad for business. They may lose a client. They may even lose their jobs." And then he said, "These men voluntarily have gone behind the Iron Curtain. They're already taken over by the communists. The only difference is that for the present at least, they can still get out any time they really want to, and we could not. How can they manipulate the vast majority into accepting socialism when they really don't want it. It's called revolutionary parliamentarianism, a pincers movement applying political pressure from above and from below. Now, when they talk about pressure from above, they mean using their people and their influence within the very government marked for takeover to bring forward official recommendations for legislation. The pressure from below, then, involves using their influence over the various mass membership organizations of the country to create the appearance of great popular support for these recommendations. Of course, the members of those organizations must never suspect that they're being used to promote the communist program. Now, the silent majority, the average person with no particular axe to grind, is caught right in the middle. He looks above and sees highly respected spokesmen for government calling for socialist legislation. He looks below and sees mobs of demonstrators shouting for the same thing. He says to himself, has everyone gone crazy, or is it me? Now, he's still in the majority, of course, but he doesn't know it. He thinks he's helplessly outnumbered, and he bows to what he thinks is the democratic will of the majority. Then the whole process starts all over again with new recommendations from above, new demands from below, and finally new capitulation in the halls of Congress. In this way, the nation can move to the left in giant strides until the ultimate goal of communism itself is reached entirely legally through the constitutional process and in the name of the nation. The entire process was best described, I think, by Martin Luther King. He wrote an article for Saturday Review, which appeared in the April 3rd, 1965 issue. And here is how he described it. The goal of the demonstrations in Selma, as elsewhere, is to dramatize the existence of injustice and to bring about the presence of justice by means of non-violence. Long years of experience indicate to us that Negroes can achieve this goal when four things occur. 1. Nonviolent demonstrators go into the streets to exercise their constitutional rights. 2. Racists resist by unleashing violence against them. 3. Americans of conscience, in the name of decency, demand federal intervention and legislation. And 4. The administration, under mass pressure, initiates measures of immediate intervention and remedial legislation. What are the countermeasures that need to be taken? And where do we begin? We begin by knowing what not to do. We must not be led into placing the blame for the riots, the civil disorders, on the Negro people of our nation. Even those few who are promoting hatred and violence in the black communities are not themselves the cause. They're merely being used by forces far bigger than they are to promote the violent phase of the revolution in America. We mustn't resort to violence either as a means of furthering political or social goals. And we must do everything humanly possible to discourage others from doing so. We must not look to the expansion of government and government programs as the solution. As I hope I've made it clear by now, this is exactly what the communists want us to do, because it's the very process whereby they hope to come to power in this country through nonviolent means. We must recapture the American faith in the free enterprise system. Capitalism has become almost a dirty word in some places, mainly because its defenders were busy enjoying the fruits of capitalism while its enemies were busy writing books and giving lectures. Consequently, capitalism has retreated steadily before the onslaught of socialism and now is struggling for its very existence. Next, and this is probably the most difficult task of all, we must carry this message regarding the dual nature of communist revolution to our friends, our neighbors, our business associates, and everyone who will listen. We must discover the identity of those individuals, both above and below, who consciously are furthering the communist program for revolution, and then remove them from their positions of trust and leadership. Anything less than that will be totally futile, because we'll merely be running around trying to put out 1 or 2 fires over here, while they're busy setting 10 new ones over there. If communism should ever come to America, we'll face more death, destruction, and human suffering than any people in history has ever faced at the hands of their invading conquerors. And it would make no difference whether the road to communism were traveled violently or non-violently. The so-called expropriation of the capitalists that would lie at the end of that road would constitute one of the greatest bloodbaths of history. We have now passed the point of painless solutions and parlor patriotism. There was a time, and not too long ago, I think, when we could have pulled ourselves out of this without too great a sacrifice on the part of anyone. But we didn't. Instead, we slept. And one by one, those laws were stricken down by the Supreme Court. Congress failed to repair the damage, and our defenses are no more. Now the enemy is inside our gates. He is on our streets. He is in our halls of Parliament. And now there is hell to pay. It's now inevitable that some of us, even in this room, will lose our lives in the communist revolution that already is raging around us. I can't tell you who it's going to be, of course. But I can tell you that it'll make no practical difference whether we're resisting at the time or whether we're merely trying to hide. Most of the casualties will occur because people just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's literally a question of life and death for all of us. And it's about time the American people began to face up to that fact and to act accordingly. I have no idea of what each of you is going to do in the critical days that lie ahead. It may be much, it may be little, it may be nothing at all. I don't know. Only you can answer that question. But ladies and gentlemen, whatever it is you decide to do for your country, do it soon. Do it now. Every minute that you delay further will add dearly to the price of ultimate victory. Thank you.
Over 50 years after this lecture, we are reaping the increasingly bitter fruits of our inaction. The steady creep of anti-white, globalist, communist government has continued ever since that time. The US is now a country where Antifa soldiers can wreak havoc, burn cities and even murder people, and have the backing of the politicians and media. It is a country where the left has embedded activist district attorneys to ensure that even when they are arrested, the Antifa thugs are quickly set free. We see all the tactics mentioned in the lecture being used today. We see the American people betrayed and befuddled from above and below. It is undeniable that the US has already fallen to socialism because the globalist-run media and political systems control the popular narrative. They get to determine who gets heard and who does not. They get to determine what is truth and what is not. Even most so-called conservatives seem either oblivious or indifferent to the fact that they support big government, debt spending and the progressive social agenda. The choice at this election, I have to tell you, is more socialism, whoever wins. Government keeps getting bigger, the debt just keeps growing, more third world migrants flood in, and the overt leftist influence in the country just keeps getting stronger. Yes, it was great that Trump ended the anti-white indoctrination courses in the federal government, and yes, it's great that he has at least identified the Antifa terror squads as such. But the direction of society is still clear. The momentum is still with the globalists. And even if Trump were minded to seriously tackle them, he only has 4 more years at most. What we need throughout the West is a popular awakening to how BLM, Antifa and this virus are being used to implement globalist authoritarianism for everyone. Just as Griffin said in the lecture, communists want to create dependence on government, and by deliberately crashing the world economy for this most ridiculous of reasons, They are doing just that, and on an unprecedented scale. And for those who still won't play ball, there seems to be emerging that most communistic of all solutions.
Next question, the member for Lanark Frontenac Kingston.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Premier. In my supplemental question yesterday, I asked this government if the people of Ontario should prepare for internment camps. In September, the federal government posted a call for expressions of interest for contractors to supply, provide and manage quarantine isolation camps throughout every province and every territory in Canada. These quarantine isolation camps, however, are not limited to people with COVID, but provide a wide latitude for many people to be detained. Surely this government is aware of the intentions to build these isolation camps from coast to coast. And my question to the Premier is, how many of these camps will be built, and how many people does this government expect to detain?
Question. Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is very true that when people leave the country and when they come back in, that the province is suggesting, and the federal government, in cooperation with the federal government, we are suggesting that people isolate themselves. That has been a practice that has been very successful, not only here in the province of Ontario, but across Canada. And we will, of course, be redoubling our efforts to make sure that the people of the province of Ontario remain safe, Mr. Speaker. So if the member is referring to the fact that that one of the public health policies is that when you return from a jurisdiction outside of the province of Ontario or from another country, that you isolate yourself for 2 weeks.
Supplementary question.
Again, back to the Premier. Here's the RFP, and in the RFP it uses clear language to express that these camps can be used for a broad spectrum of people, not limited to travellers. Indeed, it doesn't even mention international travellers. It's just a broad latitude of people. And I'll send over the copy of the RFP after. So your government must be in negotiations and aware of these plans to potentially detain and isolate citizens and residents of our country and our province. So, Speaker, to the Premier, where will these camps be built? How many people will be detained? And for what reasons?
Question.
For what reasons can people be kept in these isolation camps? And I'd like to have the Premier assure the people of Ontario.
Member, take a seat. The next question.
Once this lockdown infrastructure is cemented in place, once they are tracking your every move, once they can send you away when your mandatory test somehow comes back positive, once your job or business is rendered obsolete at the stroke of a bureaucrat's pen, once you are placed onto UBI indefinitely, if you're lucky, and this is all to say once the new normal actually becomes the new normal, then you will realise why they are acting so radically despite all the evidence. I hope Trump wins the election. Not because he's going to reverse globalism or reduce the power of government or stop the flood of legal and illegal third world migration. He won't do any of those things. I support him simply because his victory will send the left into an uncontrollable violent rage and force the government to act against them. At least to an extent. If Biden wins, this senile old sock puppet for the radicals now running his party, the man who wants to fast-track socialism and the anti-white agenda, if he wins, his health won't last a year, and it's unimaginable what the coming years will bring for our people. The globalist agenda must once and for all be confronted and defeated by popular, concerted action. An election cannot and will not settle this. Once they are completely in control, there is no going back. Once we all go behind the Iron Curtain, there will be no Cold War, because there will be no one left to fight for us. In 1969, G. Edward Griffin warned us that the longer we leave it, the more painful it will be to turn the tide against this communist filth. So I ask you, How much are you prepared to lose to the communists before you speak up and take action? Everything? Until next time, be well.